I am your host, James Morgan, and this is History of Cities.
Episode 7, Between a Rock and a Hard Place. We last left off with the unification of Greece and the expansion of the Hellenic Empire east. The successive reigns of Philip II and Alexander III, or Alexander the Great, had turned the middling kingdom of Macedonia into the first unified Greek state, and later into the largest empire of the time, with their conquests in Asia Minor, the Levant, Egypt, and Mesopotamia. It was not built to last, however, as after Alexander's death, a partition of the empire led to a series of wars that weakened Greece and left it ripe for the taking. It only remained to be seen which power would seize this golden opportunity. In today's episode, I want to go over the history of the two most likely contenders. In the west, there was the Roman Republic, and in the east, there was the Seleucid Empire. Being the crossroads between east and west, as well as an important trade depot between the Mediterranean and Black Seas, made Byzantium nervous that they would be once again caught between a rock and a hard place as two great powers clashed with each other. But before we learn of Byzantium's fate, I will start in the west with the history of Rome up until their wars with Greece. Now I will keep this history as brief as possible, because one, there's a lot that happens in the 500-year period we need to cover, and secondly, there's already a superbly made podcast that details the entire history of Rome, made by the Augustus of History podcasts, Mike Duncan. His podcast, The History of Rome, covers this period in much greater detail over the first 25 or so episodes. If you want a more in-depth telling of this story, feel free to go check those out. For those of you still here, we will start off, of course, at the beginning. According to Roman legend, their city was founded in 753 BC, or about 100 years before the founding of Byzantium. The general consensus by archaeologists is that this story is unlikely, as there is evidence of people living around the Capitoline Hill for much, much longer. By diving this far back, we are again faced with the problem we encountered in our first episode on the founding of Byzantium. That is, that historical records from this time period are like great mounds of river mud that we have to sift through to find the nuggets of golden truth. Whatever the case, the quote-unquote history of the people that would later go on to vie for control over Greece starts in 753, when the city of Rome was founded by Romulus. Using the supreme power granted to him by virtue of being the settlement's founder, Romulus created institutions that would go on to govern his people for centuries. These were the army, the religious institutions, and the Senate. The Senate was an advisory body of 100 men, chosen from each of the founding tribes of Rome, the Latins, the Sabines, and the Etruscans. Their job was to advise the king and give the consent of the people to any laws he passed. Mostly, they held no real power, but their greatest responsibility was electing a new king upon the death of the old monarch. The reigns of the 7 kings of Rome were a period of 244 years, in which the city would gradually absorb the tribes and cities around them, while also building the social and political structure that would define the later Roman Republic and much later Roman Empire. Instead of going over each king's reign, we will skip straight to the end. The last king, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, was so hated that he completely poisoned the idea of a king in the minds of the Romans. Upon his expulsion from the city in 509 BC, the Senate abolished the position of king, and the Roman Republic was born. It is honestly a testament to the strength and efficiency of Roman institutions that they were able to survive the complete removal of the office that had previously held all legislative, executive, judicial, religious, and military power. But they did more than just survive. As we will soon cover, the next 220 years of the Roman Republic was an era of relatively uninterrupted growth and expansion. The first peoples to fall to the Republic were their immediate neighbors. A series of wars against the tribes and cities closest in proximity ended with Rome establishing a moderately secure grip over their region. They would deal with uprisings and revolts in Italy throughout their long history, but for the time being they were able to live in relative peace. Peace ended in 390 BC, when rampaging Gallic tribes streamed down through northern Italy until they met a Roman army at the Battle of Allia River. The Romans did not treat these tribes as the grave threat that they were, and when they met in battle, the Romans were utterly unprepared for both the size and ferocity of the Gallic force. The complete defeat of the Roman forces in this battle left the road to Rome wide open, and the victorious tribesmen seized upon this chance to sack the city. While this debacle was greatly humiliating to the proud Romans, they were not wiped off the face of the map as they feared they would be. Possibly the greatest asset that the Roman people held during their entire history was their ability to withstand defeat and adapt to changing situations. Following the sack of Rome, the Republic would rebuild and rise from the ashes as a more determined and hardened force with unmatched ambition to become so powerful that they would never experience such a defeat again. After spending the next few decades recovering from their humiliating defeat at the hands of the Gallic invaders, Rome set their sight on uniting the entire Italian peninsula under their rule. Standing in their way were rival tribes of Latins, Samnites, and Etruscans. The Latin tribes on the peninsula tried to form an alliance amongst each other to defeat the Romans, but after the Latin War of 340 to 338 BC, they capitulated to Roman authority. The Samnites put up a longer, yet ultimately just as doomed fight in a series of wars called the Samnite Wars, which lasted from 343 to 290 BC. In 282 BC, the Romans completed their conquest of the peninsula by eradicating the last Etruscan holdouts. At this point, they were significant power in the Mediterranean world, which brought them to the attention of the other great powers in the region, Carthage and the Greek kingdoms. In the same year that they conquered the Etruscans, a confrontation with the city of Tarentum led to the first conflict between Romans and Greeks. The Tarentines were situated on the southern coast of Italy and were close trading partners with the Greek kingdom of Epirus, who ruled on the eastern side of the Adriatic. When the Romans declared war, the Tarentines were worried that they would be the next in a long line of Roman conquests, so they begged Epirus to send an army to help them. Pyrrhus, the king of Epirus, personally led an army of 25,000 men and 20 elephants to Italy in 280 BC. The first contest ended in a Roman defeat as they had never encountered elephants before and were terrified of these monsters. However, this defeat was yet another learning opportunity for the Romans, and they would steadily hone their skills against elephant warfare until they were no longer an overwhelming force. But for the time being, Pyrrhus still held all the initiative, and he marched his army towards Rome. He was forced to turn back before reaching the city when two Roman reinforcement armies threatened to envelop him. The following battle that took place between Pyrrhus and these two armies was so costly to the Greeks that it is where we get the term Pyrrhic victory. Despite technically winning the battle, the unfavorable position Pyrrhus now found himself in Italy prompted him to answer a call for help from the Greek colonies on Sicily. He gladly disengaged himself before the Romans could form up and attack him again. On Sicily, he entered into conflict with another Mediterranean great power. This time it was an invading force from the Carthaginian Empire. Pyrrhus was able to alleviate his ally Syracuse, but was unable to completely expunge the invaders from the island. The local Greek cities soon grew to detest their savior's despotic ruling style, and in 275 BC, Pyrrhus decided to return to Italy rather than face a rebellion in Sicily. The second go-around in Italy was not nearly as successful as the first, and Pyrrhus was forced to return to Greece when war broke out between Epirus and the neighboring kingdom of Macedonia. The Pyrrhic War gave the Romans a taste of Greek blood, and soon they would arrive on the eastern shore of the Adriatic in search of more. Before that happens, the Romans will have to contend with their other rivals in the Mediterranean, the Carthaginians. This contest is known to history as the Punic Wars. In the most simple and brief terms at hand, the Punic Wars were two wars that saw Rome face off against their most powerful rival in the western Mediterranean, Carthage. The wars caused a great upheaval in the ancient world, and the consequences were numerous. Among these included the expansion of the Roman navy, the Roman conquest of Iberia and Sicily, along with many other former Carthaginian territories, the complete dismantling of the Carthaginian Empire, relegating it to a minor power, and most importantly to our story, Hannibal's invasion of Italy, prompting the Greeks to begin looking westward for opportunities of expansion. It is here that we will take a little break from our story in the west to take a look at what had been going on east of Byzantium. Rome is about 100 years older than Byzantium, which is in turn about 100 years older than the empire we are about to begin our Eastern story with. The Persian Empire, or Achaemenid Empire, after the Achaemenid dynasty of its founder Cyrus the Great, was the principal antagonist of our first few episodes. Due to most history of this time period being sourced from Greeks, it is easy to see how the Persians are often painted as barbarian tyrants, but in reality, they were not fundamentally any different than any other culture at the time. They ruled a vast territory, the largest of its day in fact, with many different people. Holding this vast empire together required them to have a highly sophisticated and rational bureaucracy. The systems they developed over their 220 years of existence would be the basis on which many future empires would model themselves. Despite this efficient level of administration, the Persian kings were always dealing with revolts from provinces whose cultural origins clashed with the Persian domination. That probably meant that when a revolt broke out in the far western province of Ionia, Darius the Great treated it like any other chronic annoyance of governance. Little did he know that the course of events springing from this particular revolt would mean the end of his family's empire 150 years after his death. As we have discussed in our first 6 episodes, the Greeks of Ionia went through a tumultuous growing period following the Ionian Revolt, which culminated in the Greek world being united by Philip II and Alexander the Great. Alexander's expedition into the east probably looked to Darius III as a repeat of the Second Greco-Persian War, where the Greeks would make some noise and maybe retake the Greek cities in the western portion of Anatolia. He must have been horrified to find that soon Alexander was conquering the rich provinces of the Levant and Egypt, eventually making his way all the way to the Persian homeland and beyond. In a brutally quick 4-year campaign, the empire that had withstood for over 200 years was conquered by a people they had once ruled over. The territory previously ruled by the Persians would only remain united under the Hellenic Empire for a measly 7 years before Alexander's death caused it to be split into many different regions, nominally all ruled under the Greek banner, but in reality very separate. There was an initial partition of Alexander's territory under the regent chosen to rule after his death. This first partition put former military officers in charge of large swaths of important territory, but each of them was not satisfied with anything less than the whole of the Hellenic Empire. As a result, a revolt eventually broke out in which the regent was killed and a new partition was decided upon. Importantly to our story, the province of Babylonia was given to a general named Seleucus. He set himself up in the ancient city of Babylon and began plotting his ascension. He was not alone in this ambition, as Antigonus, who ruled over a large portion of Anatolia, as well as Syria, clashed with Ptolemy of Egypt and Cassander of Macedon, each of whom was anxious about one provincial governor overtaking the others. Seleucus allied himself with Ptolemy in the Third War of the Diadochi, which saw Antigonus forced to defend himself against the other 3 Greek powers. In the end, Antigonus was able to defend against his rivals with the help of Lysimachus and Byzantium, which we discussed in episode 6. The treaty that concluded the war left the Hellenic Empire divided under 5 rulers. Cassander ruled Macedon and Greece proper, Lysimachus ruled Thrace and western Anatolia, Ptolemy ruled Egypt and Cyprus, Seleucus was left out, but still held a great deal of power. Antigonus was left the strongest Hellenic ruler in his provinces of eastern Anatolia, Syria, and Phoenicia. He was in the best position to succeed Alexander in ruling all the Hellenic Empire, but he did not want to fight another war on multiple fronts. To this end, he first set his sight on removing Seleucus in the east. Seleucus had been specifically excluded from the treaty negotiations by Antigonus, but he was able to return to Babylon and reclaim his title as ruler due to the large army provided by his ally Ptolemy. His former capital was still occupied by Antigonus's troops, and so he dammed up the nearby Euphrates to allow the water to build up until he broke the dam and flooded the occupied fortress. At this time, Antigonus was still negotiating with the other powers over the peace terms of the Third War of the Diadochi and could not personally attend to this annoyance in his eastern provinces. His governors in Media, Aria, Euagoras, and Nicanor decided to take the initiative and sent an army of about 17,000 men to obliterate Seleucus's measly 3,400 men. However, they bumbled into a marsh along the Tigris where Seleucus had been laying a trap, and he was able to quickly kill all the Greek soldiers that were in the army. This meant that the remaining Iranian soldiers switched sides as they recognized Seleucus as the rightful ruler of Babylon. Suddenly, this minor annoyance became a serious threat to the integrity of Antigonus's eastern flank. After concluding the peace terms with his rivals, Antigonus sent his son with a fresh army to root out Seleucus, who had had freed reign of the east after his battle near the Tigris. When Antigonus's son reached the city of Babylon, nobody was home, but even without the presence of Seleucus, loyal partisans within the city made it impossible for an occupation to endure. Antigonus decided to personally lead the next attempt to excise Seleucus, but he ran into the same problems his son had in Babylon. On his way back home to Syria, Antigonus finally met Seleucus's army in the field. But Seleucus took the adage, "the early bird gets the worm," to heart, and he had his men eat their breakfast before the light of dawn. They were then able to attack while Antigonus's soldiers were still cooking their morning meal, and utterly routed them. This forced Antigonus to fully retreat from the east and recognize Seleucus as the ruler of the eastern Greek provinces. Not only did this set the Seleucid Empire up as the potential successor to the Persian Empire, it also ended all hope that Antigonus had of stepping into Alexander the Great's shoes. As a result of the seesaw of power struggle, while Antigonus's fortunes sank, Seleucus's rose. While the treaty that ended the Third War of the Diadochi more or less set out the boundaries agreed upon by the four successors to Alexander, it did not resolve the conflicting ambitions of each one to rule the entire Greek world. Even with his recent defeat against Seleucus, it was the ever-restless and aggressive Antigonus who broke the peace by sending his son to first take Athens and then Cyprus. Antigonus's further attempts to take the island of Rhodes, as well as invade Egypt, drew attention away from his recent conquests, and his rival in Greece, Cassander, was able to retake Cyprus and set to besieging Athens. These gains made by Cassander were quickly reversed when Antigonus's son lifted the siege and proceeded to kick Cassander out of northern and central Greece. The situation seemed pretty dire for Cassander, and he even attempted to surrender, but his request was not accepted. However, there was still a chance for the tides to turn, as Cassander's allies, Lysimachus in Thrace and Seleucus in the east, had been busy at the onset of this Fourth War of the Diadochi, but were now able to join in to prevent Antigonus from gaining complete control of Greece. It began with Lysimachus crossing the Hellespont and invading Asia Minor. This relieved pressure from Cassander as the theater of war shifted to Anatolia. With this new threat from the west, as well as the possibility of invasion from both Egypt and the east, Antigonus was forced to change to a more defensive strategy. While he recalled his son's armies from Greece and raised his own in Syria, Lysimachus rampaged through western Anatolia. Despite not having a major army contesting him, Lysimachus was only able to procure moderate gains during the campaign season. The arrival of winter, as well as the imminent possibility of Antigonus arriving with a massive army, forced Lysimachus to hold up in a city on the northern coast of Anatolia. The winter months of 302 BC saw all the important pieces move into place for what was sizing up to be the decisive battle of not only this war, but of the entire contest between Alexander's successors. Lysimachus was trapped in Asia Minor, with Antigonus breathing down his neck, and Antigonus's son blocking reinforcement from Cassander. A fraction of Cassander's army was able to skirt this blockade, but not nearly as many men as Lysimachus had hoped for. Luckily, reinforcements from the east, led by Seleucus, had arrived just in time to even the odds before the great battle. Antigonus's forces consisted of about 70,000 infantry, most of which were from his Syrian army, and supplemented by reinforcements from Greece. 10,000 cavalry and 75 war elephants rounded out his forces. The allied coalition facing him had around 64,000 infantry, 10,500 cavalry, 400 war elephants, and 120 chariots. As we can see, the two sides were fairly evenly matched, with the allies having many more war elephants as well as chariots, but the Antagonids having better trained cavalry units. Both sides had brought their full strength to the table, and defeat on this field would almost certainly mean defeat in the war. The choice of battlefield, a large flat plain outside the village of Ipsus, reflects the change in tactics since the reforms of Philip II. The Greek armies now relied on cavalry charges much more heavily than they ever had in the past, and gone were the days of rocky terrain that favored static phalanx formations. Due to the fact that the commanders on each side of the field had learned their tactics and strategy from Philip and Alexander, both sides shared each other's weaknesses and strengths. The Allies hoped that their numerical advantage in special units, elephants and chariots, would tip the balanced scales towards their direction. The battle was very characteristic of the Diadochi Wars, in that the heavy infantry faced each other in the center, while protected on the flanks by lighter infantry, as cavalry rode around the mass of men, hoping to find a weakness to break the stalemate. In this particular case, the center was preceded by a line of elephants for each side. The Allies' line was equal to the Antigonids', suggesting that nearly 3/4 of their elephants were held in reserve. The Antigonid strategy sought to circumvent this line of elephants by leading a mass cavalry charge around the right flank. This tactic was initially successful, and Antigonus' son was able to rout the enemy cavalry and expose the infantry. But instead of maintaining formation and attacking the exposed back of the enemy phalanx, the victorious cavalry chased the routed cavalry and became isolated. It was at this moment the reserve of 300 elephants moved into position to cut off the Antigonid infantry from their cavalry. Without the support of their horses, the Antigonid center gradually crumbled until allied javelin skirmishers were able to get in range of Antigonus and killed him. The death of Antigonus marked the end of the battle, the end of the war, and indeed the end of any chance of Hellenic reunification. Of the over 80,000 Antigonid forces that took the field, less than 9,000 escaped. The war had begun with 4 kings vying for control of the Hellenic Empire, and now there were 3. Lysimachus and Seleucus divided up Antigonus's territory between themselves, with Seleucus gaining by far the most. The Seleucid Empire was now the strongest in the region, and to commemorate this great triumph, Seleucus founded a new capital in Syria, which he named Antioch. In the future, Antioch will be one of the most important cities in the East, and will be Byzantium's direct rival for potential capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. Peace between the Hellenic states was never a possibility, and the death of Cassander in 298 BC kicked off a 13-year struggle for control over Macedonia, which drew in all the major Greek kings, including Pyrrhus of Epirus, who we discussed in the Roman section of this episode. This conflict was long and complicated and bloody, but it ended up somehow with Antigonus's grandson, Antigonus Gonatas, as ruler of most of Macedonia, with the rest going to Lysimachus. Another set of dynastic disputes, this time in Egypt and Thrace, pitted erstwhile allies Lysimachus and Seleucus against each other. Seleucus was able to kill Lysimachus in a battle in Anatolia, and proceeded to expand his territory all the way to the eastern coast of the Aegean Sea. He even threatened to capture Byzantium and the rest of Thrace, but upon landing on the western shore, he was assassinated. His death in 281 BC marked the end of the great struggle of Alexander's successors, and an era of relative stability would begin in the Hellenic world. Antigonus Gonatas ruled in Greece, Seleucus's son Antiochus ruled all the eastern territories, and Ptolemy Philadelphus ruled in Egypt and southern Syria, with none of them being able to match the massive expansions their predecessors had taken. In particular, the Seleucid Empire that had seemed so likely to be the next Eastern empire to conquer Byzantium in 281 underwent a series of setbacks over the next 60 years, which eroded their position and lessened the threat of an Eastern invasion. The Byzantines would not have long to relax, however, as in 223 BC, Antiochus III would take the throne and begin the revitalization of the Seleucid Empire. It is at this point that we have caught up to our discussion of the West, and we will merge the two poles into a narrative on the Roman-Greek wars, starting with the First Macedonian War. In the year 217 BC, the kingdom of Macedon was ruled by a distant descendant of Antigonus the Diadochi, named Philip V of Macedon. He was a young and ambitious ruler who was eager to expand his realm through military means, as he fashioned himself after Alexander the Great and Philip II. In this pivotal year, Philip V was in the midst of a war with a league of Greek city-states that opposed Macedonian domination, when he received news that the Romans were on the verge of catastrophe in the Second Punic War. Hannibal had just crossed the Alps and won a stunning victory of the Roman legions in Italy. When the court of Philip heard of this development in the west, they quickly urged the king to make peace with his Greek enemies and prepare for an invasion of Italy. Philip was easily convinced and began the construction of a fleet of ships that he could use to land a surprise invasion force on the far coast of the Adriatic Sea. The Macedonians were famously not a very savvy naval society, and so they chose to build small, fast ships to hopefully evade the Roman fleet rather than face them in battle. In previous centuries, the Romans had also not been known as a particularly powerful naval force, but their defeat of the Carthaginians in the First Punic War had raised their standing exponentially. After a year of preparations, the Macedonian fleet was ready to set sail. They speedily rounded the Greek peninsula and made for the city of Apollonia in modern-day Albania, which was the closest city to the Italian coast on the east side of the Adriatic. However, as they approached, the scouts spotted a small group of Roman ships also heading towards Apollonia. Perhaps due to his youth and inexperience, Philip panicked at the sight of these ships and ordered the fleet to return to Macedonia, despite the fact that his force outnumbered the Romans 10-1. In 215 BC, Hannibal's continued success in Italy prompted Philip to approach him with terms for an alliance between Carthage and Macedon. This alliance did not include promises of a Macedonian invasion of Italy, as Philip had become less enamored with that idea after the embarrassment of the previous year. Instead, Philip would focus on Roman allies and holdings in Illyria to draw resources away from Rome, while Hannibal continued his rampage through the peninsula. Unfortunately for the new allies, a Roman fleet patrolling the Adriatic stumbled upon emissaries carrying details of the terms of alliance. Now Rome was aware that Carthage was plotting with Macedon, and they were forced to spread their already thin resources even thinner by sending more warships and men to reinforce the fleet in the Adriatic. This newly reinforced fleet was unable to prevent Philip from beginning his second attempt at invading Illyria in 214 BC. He was initially successful in catching the Roman garrisons off guard and lightly manned. But when the Roman legions in the area heard news of the capture of Oricum and the siege at Apollonia, they hastily moved to nip this nascent invasion in the bud. They successfully retook Oricum and lifted the siege of Apollonia, forcing Philip to retreat back to Macedonia and leave behind a substantial amount of men, ships, and supplies. The second failure at a naval invasion of Illyria completely soured Philip to the water. The next 2 years saw all his further campaigns conducted entirely on land. These campaigns were much more successful, and Philip was able to conquer many interior cities in Illyria. Eventually, he took the coastal city of Lissus and was once again able to threaten an invasion of the Roman homeland. The gradual advance of Philip in the east and the perpetual plague of Hannibal at home forced the Romans to seek out alliances that could help relieve some of the pressure they were feeling on all sides. Rome already had numerous trading partners in the Greek world, including Byzantium, but most of these cities had decided to stay neutral during the conflict, as their primary motivation was monetary gain through trading with both Greeks and Romans. There was one possible ally in Greece that the Romans looked to in 211 BC, and that was the league that Philip had been at war with before he had shifted his focus to Rome. This was the Aetolian League that comprised a large chunk of southern Greece, and if they could be persuaded to join the Roman cause, would offer a route to direct invasion of the Macedonian heartland. Had the Romans approached the Aetolian League at the onset of the First Macedonian War, they would have likely refused to join. They had just been whooped by Philip and were in no shape to continue fighting. But it had been 5 years since they concluded peace terms with Macedon. Now they were back in fighting shape and all too eager to get revenge. In 211, an agreement was made that the Aetolians would fight the Macedonians on land, while the Romans supported them from the sea. Philip was still in Illyria when he heard that the Aetolians had joined with his enemies. Being young and energetic, Philip was quick to spring into action. He knew that invasion from the south was inevitably coming, so unless he wanted to fight a war on two fronts, he needed to secure his northern border before heading home to defend his land. He rapidly marched through Illyria and Thrace, capturing towns and garrisoning them to reinforce his flank. He then returned home, where he was greeted with the news that the Aetolians were preparing to march on his ally Acarnania. All the men of Acarnania had sworn that they would resist the invasion to the last man, and Philip mobilized his army to aid in this defense. Put off by the zeal shown by the Acarnanians and the additional prospect of facing a determined Macedonian army, the Aetolians cancelled their planned invasion and instead decided to spend the winter planning an alternative course of action. The following spring of 210 BC saw a further expansion of the coalition against Macedon's activities in Greece. The Roman fleet had complete control of the Aegean, and the coalition was growing as more Greek states joined in. At this point, the Roman commander was so confident of the position in Greece that he recommended that the legion in the east be recalled to help defend Italy. However, the coalition's position was not as absolutely secure as they might believe, and Philip took advantage of their arrogance to take the initiative. Throughout 210, he steadily made gains as he took city after city. The next year, he won 2 battles against coalition forces and forced them to hunker down in the city of Lamia. These victories worried the neutral parties, as they feared an ascendant Macedonia would threaten the balance of power in the region and further disrupt trade. Rather than join in the fighting, the neutral states attempted to arrange for a peace conference in Achaia. The peace talks almost immediately broke down as coalition reinforcements arrived in Greece, breathing new energy into the Aetolians, who demanded concessions from Philip. The Macedonian king took great offense at these demands, and the chance for a peaceful resolution went out the window as he stormed off. The next few years of hostilities went much the same way as the last few had, with Philip able to repeatedly defeat his foes in nearly every engagement. Despite his remarkable success on the battlefield, Philip was still having to fight an essentially defensive war. There were too many enemies to deal with on too many fronts, and the war that had started as a joint operation between Carthage and Macedon to dismantle the Roman Republic was nowhere near that goal. Finally, in 206 BC, the neutral parties led by Egypt, Rhodes, and Byzantium were able to broker a peace. However, the Romans rejected this peace, and the next year they launched another invasion, but this attempt was swiftly quashed by Philip, and in 205 BC, the First Macedonian War officially ended. While Philip had been able to defend his territory, and had even gained some with the annexation of Illyria, the fact remained that the original purpose of the Carthage-Macedon alliance was completely negated. The Roman objective of preventing the Greeks from linking up with Hannibal in Italy was a success. All in all, very little changed in the political situation in the east. The Seleucid Empire was unable to capitalize on the chaos in Greece, as they were still undergoing the reconquest of their eastern territories. Had they joined either side in the First Macedonian War, the balance of power could have easily been tipped, and the peace that Byzantium enjoyed by being a neutral trading partner would have been put in jeopardy. But for the time being, the balance remained, and Byzantium remained perched between a rock and a hard place. Next time, we will continue our journey through the Roman-Greek wars to see if Byzantium would be able to remain independent and prosperous, or if they would be crushed in the clash between East and West.
As always, if you have any questions or think I missed anything, please feel free to email me at hofcpod.cast@gmail.com or DM me on Twitter at HOFC_podcast. Thank you for listening to this episode, and please join me next time for the history of Byzantium.